Not a week passes without us hearing of some shocking financial scam committed either by the previous regime or by senior ministers of the present regime. But I'm not going to talk about that because there's very little that any of us can do except pray that justice will be done and done speedily. I want to focus on aspects of theft that we rarely talk about in our churches, let alone the wider society in which we live. You shall not steal implies that there is something that properly belongs to me and to which therefore I have a right. If somebody takes that from me, I'm morally injured. But we need to set this command within the wider context of Old Testament law. Remember that ancient Israel was an agrarian society, and they were told from the time they entered the land that the land in which they lived belonged to God. God was the ultimate owner. They were sojourners. They were resident tenants. The land was parceled out amongst their clans and families, each one receiving a family inheritance. And if in times of economic hardship they sold that land to a neighbor, then when conditions got better, they had first priority in redeeming the land. And then every 50th year, that is after 7 Sabbath years, land reverted to its original owners. This was a way the law ensured, if it was practiced, and scholars are not sure whether it actually was practiced, but at least the intent of the law was to prevent a society from emerging where a few people owned all the land and the rest simply lived as landless laborers, as bond slaves on other people's fields. And sadly, that's the situation in many parts of the world today. The Israelites were also told that when they harvested their land, they were not to touch the borders. They were to leave the borders for those who had no land, like poor migrants, to come and pluck from the corn or the fruit that was grown on the trees. So the law recognized our natural selfishness, but attempted to put some brakes on it. The limits on private property express God's concern, not only for the economically vulnerable, but God's concern for social solidarity. That in a society where there are deep inequalities of wealth, there is no social solidarity, no sense of being one people, one society. Now, the early Christian church took that thinking further. They lived in a Roman society, and under Roman law, property rights were regarded as absolute. If something belonged to me, I could do with it whatever I wanted. And the early church fathers consistently challenged, they confronted that view of property. So St. Augustine, the great church leader of the 4th century, wrote, I quote, "The one who uses his wealth badly possesses it wrongfully, and wrongful possession means that it is now another's property." So the true meaning of ownership for Augustine is to be found in putting property to right use. If owners use property badly, for example, by just leaving it to idle or squandering it in luxurious living, while others have barely enough for physical survival, then they are really possessing property that belongs to others. The right of ownership does not imply the right to abuse what one owns, as in the Roman legal conception, but only the right to use it well. And to use it well means to use property for our own well-being and for the well-being of others. So if, for example, there is land that is left idle because people are waiting for the price to go up before they can sell, and there are many impoverished peasants around, those impoverished, malnourished peasants have every right to take that land, till it, cultivate it, to grow food for their survival. If people own houses that they are not using, they are left derelict, again waiting for the price to go up. The homeless people have every right to take those houses and occupy them. Because the right to life trumps the right to private property. That wasn't just something that Augustine said. Let me quote to you from other famous church fathers. A contemporary of Augustine, John Chrysostom, quote, "This also is theft, not to share one's possessions. I beg you remember this without fail, that not to share our own wealth with the poor is theft from the poor and deprivation of their means of life, because we do not possess our own wealth, but theirs." Another quotation, Basil of Caesarea, another great church leader, living just a few decades before Chrysostom and Augustine. "That bread which you keep belongs to the hungry. That coat which you preserve in your wardrobe belongs to the naked. Those shoes which are rotting in your possession belongs to the shoeless. That gold which you've hidden in the ground, or today we would say in our bank vaults, belongs to the needy. Wherefore, as often as you were able to help others and refused, so often did you do them wrong." And the great Thomas Aquinas, the Christian philosopher of the 13th century, "In cases of need, all things are common property. So there would seem to be no sin in taking another's property, for need has made it common." So what these great theologians, Christian leaders of the church would have said is that if I have bread in my house that I don't need for my survival, because I'm amply fed, and my next door neighbor is starving, and if he comes into my house and takes that bread, he is not committing an act of theft. I am the one who is the thief by withholding it from him. If I have clothes in my wardrobe that I have never used for more than a year, if a person who has no clothes comes and takes those clothes, he's not a thief. I am the thief by withholding from him what belongs to him. So I suggest you go through your wardrobes and look at the clothes you've never used. They don't belong to you. And if we as a church have large long-term deposit accounts, and yet there are people in our congregation who can't afford 3 meals a day, can't afford their rents, we as a church are robbing them. That money belongs to them. Now this is orthodox, basic, fundamental Christian theology, which the church has forgotten, because the church has been seduced by the thinking of the non-Christian world. If you look at the way the global economy functions today, the net financial flows in the global economy are not from the rich nations to the poor. Interest on debt repayments and high taxes or tariffs on exports means that the poor nations send to the rich north every year, on average, around $50 billion more than what they receive in foreign aid and in what's called foreign direct investment. But to obtain a more accurate figure, you should add the cost to the poor nations of the export to the rich nations of engineers, doctors, scientists, accountants, bankers, most of whom have been trained in state institutions at local taxpayers' expense, and yet the moment they are qualified, they emigrate to the rich, or they're actively recruited by rich governments and corporations. But you also need to add to that figure the fortunes of poor countries that are siphoned off by corrupt politicians and business leaders, exported to banks in Switzerland or Singapore or the Cayman Islands, so-called offshore tax havens. And many major accountancy companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, famous banks like Credit Suisse or UBS or HSBC have been exposed as acting as middlemen in establishing bogus companies called shell companies in which the super rich individuals and corporations hide their wealth from the tax authorities. Last year, if you remember, Oxfam revealed that 62 people owned as much wealth as half the world's population, with a staggering $7.6 trillion hidden in offshore tax havens. So the lifestyles of the rich are being subsidized by the global poor. This is theft on an unimaginable scale. And we are complicit in it. Most of us work in offices, whether business offices or banks or government offices, and when we think of stealing, you normally think of acts like maybe stealing your employer's time by doing your private work in the office, or stealing some little property, taking home ballpoint pens or notepads, maybe falsifying expense accounts, cheating on tax returns. In other words, how we steal from our employers. But rarely do we ask, how do our employers steal from us? And how do they steal from the general public? How does our work contribute to huge acts of public theft? The most obvious way that businesses steal is by overcharging customers or providing sub-quality goods or services. And where companies sell toxic, dangerous goods such as tobacco or pharmaceutical drugs that have not been certified by regulatory bodies, they steal their customers' health and even their lives. And when they pollute rivers and oceans and the air that we breathe, they steal from what we call the commons, the air, the water, the beaches, the public spaces that belong to all of us. The rainforests, the oceans, the Arctic, the Antarctic, these are not the property of any corporation or government. They are our common global human heritage. We should think of them the way we think of the great works of art and music and architecture, which are world heritage, part of our global human legacy. They belong to the whole global family. Now that is why global warming and severe climatic events that global warming leads to are not just expressions of environmental damage, they are acts of blatant injustice. Because the climate system is what unites us wherever we happen to live. Men and women, black or white, rich or poor. The climate reminds us that we belong to one world. We are all dependent on what's called the carbon cycle. So human-induced climate change is nothing less than the theft of the commons by the rich world and the rich elites in poor countries. We pollute the atmosphere and the commons. We steal from the rest of humankind their means of survival. The atmosphere and the oceans have become the medium by which wealthy corporations, governments, and individuals transfer their harmful activities to other regions and people. And the people who suffer most from global warming are the people who are least responsible for it. Now, how are such acts of public theft hidden from the public gaze? Why is it that we are often blind to these things? I suggest that it's largely because of the language that is used, language that is deceptive, language that distracts us, language that we don't really scrutinize more carefully. Think, for example, of the language of corporate social responsibility, or CSR. If you have a business that's producing goods or services that are needed in society and producing them at fair prices, it pays its workers a decent wage, provides safe work conditions, pays its taxes to the government, does not harm the environment, such a business, such a company is socially responsible. It's an ethical company. Why does it need to then have some project or projects that express what it's called its corporate social responsibility? I haven't researched into this, I confess, but I'm sure if you do take a survey of all the companies, you'll find that the ones who have the largest CSR departments are the ones whose core activities are unethical and harmful to society or the environment. It's a way of diverting or distracting attention to the core activities of that business. So why do we go along with that language instead of challenging it and reminding businesses what it really means to be ethical, socially responsible? A second example, think of people who call themselves self-made businessmen. Or we hear about the heroic individual entrepreneur, people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, or if you go back 100 years, Henry Ford or Thomas Edison. Now, yes, these were supremely talented individuals, but they would never have been able to do what they did without the support of a host of collective institutions. There was a scientific infrastructure that enabled them to acquire their knowledge. There was company law and other commercial laws that made it possible for them later to build companies with large and complex organization. They benefited from an educational system that supplied well-trained scientists, engineers, managers, and technicians to man those companies. There was a financial system that enabled them to raise large amounts of capital when they wanted to expand. There were patents and copyright laws that protected their inventions, easily accessible markets for their products, and so on. Without those institutions, those social institutions, they would never have thrived. The big difference between rich nations and poor nations is not that the poor nations don't have entrepreneurial energy. You just go out on the streets of Colombo, you'll find many individuals who are doing innovative things to make money. There's a lot of individual entrepreneurial energy. The difference, what makes the rich nations rich and the poor nations stagnant, is that the rich nations have organizations and institutions that are able to channel those individual entrepreneurial energies into collective entrepreneurship. So when we speak of our individual talents, whether they are musical talents or scientific talents or artistic talents, never think of these as our private possession. Think of them as social goods. They've been given to us by God through the society, the culture in which we live. If somebody is an accomplished musician, it's because he has benefited from music teachers, from craftsmen who made good quality musical instruments, from a culture or a subculture that appreciated music and gave that person space to develop that musical ability. It is not just his or her own private possession. And the tragedy in our country is that there are so many young children with great musical and artistic and intellectual scientific potential but potential that is never developed because they come from dysfunctional families, they're part of a dysfunctional education system. In other words, what we lack are those institutions that can channel that potential, nurture it, and develop it. So your individual talents are not what qualifies you or justifies your climbing up the social ladder. They're given to you for the sake of the society that has given you so much. How do scholars or academics steal from the poor? Well, think of those botanists and chemists who come, say, to an indigenous community. They take some indigenous medicinal plant, they extract some of the chemicals, they patent it, and then that community can no longer use those plants for medicinal purposes. They've got to buy it from these companies. 97% of the patents that are held worldwide are in the hands of Western corporations. And fees for global property rights are very high. Many poor countries can't afford them or don't have a full understanding of the process of patenting. Think of social scientists, experts or research students who come to interview us, to do surveys about ethnic conflict or domestic violence or poverty in Sri Lanka. They tap into our indigenous knowledge, they interview us, they go back, they write their dissertations or papers or books. Do we ever see what they publish? Does that knowledge ever filter back to us to deal with the problems that they've researched? Do we ever get a share in the royalties? Isn't that a form of academic exploitation of the poor? How does a medical profession steal? Well, government doctors who leave work early so they can go to their private clinics or private hospitals. And there in those private hospitals, they turn up late, habitually late for their appointments, give 2 or 3 minutes to a patient while charging over 1,000 rupees. Now, if they apologize and if they spend more than 2 or 3 minutes, well and good, but most of them, you know from your experience and I from mine, they don't. And unless we educated middle-class people don't demand apologies, don't protest, don't complain about these doctors to the hospitals in which they work, the system will just carry on. So in closing, since this is the Youth Fellowship Sunday, let me put 2 questions to the young people to ponder during this week. Perhaps we can begin this pondering during the Sunday discussion afterwards, to which I hope many of you will come. 2 questions to ponder. First, how does your profession steal from the public? You may be in IT, you may be in banking, you may be in advertising, you may be in marketing, engineering, whatever your profession is. Think, how does your profession steal, engage in acts of theft from the public? Secondly, if you come from a very rich family, rich by middle-class Sri Lankan standards, say your family has more than 1 house, owns a fleet of cars. Try to find out, how did your family acquire its fortune? Were there acts of theft committed by your father, grandfather, great-grandfather? Go back in your family line. Be courageous, be honest. Where did this wealth come from? And if there have been acts of theft that you can identify, how will you make restitution? Let's spend a few moments in prayer. We pray for your grace, Lord Jesus, to be honest with ourselves, to be honest before you, and also to be honest before each other. We pray for the grace to feel more deeply, to think more deeply, to care more deeply about all that's happening in our world, in our places of work, to expose evil that is hidden, to speak for justice, to have the courage to confront the powerful, Lord, hear our prayer and let our cry come unto you.